Hey, how are you doing? So today's topic is action potential, an important topic from physiology. Let's get started. So we're going to describe action potential in the following 4 subheadings. The introduction as to what action potential is, the ionic basis with action potential curve, how action potential is developed and what is the graphical representation of action potential. The third subheading is conduction of action potential. We'll study the conduction of action potential in nerve fibers. There are 2 types of nerve fibers based on myelination, unmyelinated and myelinated. So the conduction varies in these different nerve fibers. And lastly, we'll study the properties of action potential, the various properties that are important in this particular topic. So starting with introduction, action potential can be described as a brief sequence of changes in the RMP. RMP is resting membrane potential. So brief sequence of changes in the resting membrane potential when stimulated by a threshold or above stimulus. Now let's analyze this description. Brief is used because action potential is present or persists for a few milliseconds. Now what exactly is action potential? We know that in resting membrane potential, the insides of a nerve fiber, for example, are negative and outside there is positive charge. So change in the polarity at any one particular site, it may be anywhere throughout the length of the nerve. This is the entire length of the nerve. We know that at rest, throughout the length, insides are negative and outsides are positive. This is what we discussed is resting membrane potential. So changes at any site in the resting membrane potential. So changes basically means reversal of polarity or change in the polarity. It means the insides get positive and outsides get negative. This we say leads to the development of action potential. So action potential is brief because this change lasts for only a few milliseconds, say 1 millisecond. After 1 millisecond, this is reversed back to the resting membrane state, right? So brief sequence of changes in the RMP, brief because milliseconds, sequence of changes in the resting membrane potential when stimulated by a threshold or above stimulus. Now this word is really important. What do you mean by threshold stimulus? Now imagine this is any body, any mass, it is a heavy object and you are pushing it with minimal force. Will this object move? It won't move because the force you are applying is minimal. Now you suddenly increase the force, you go on increasing the force, a point will come or a force will be reached where this object just starts to move in the direction of the force, right? If you go on increasing the force, the object will just start to move at a particular level or the particular magnitude of the force. That force at which the object just starts to move is known as the threshold force. So threshold basically is just it is a starting point, like at the point where just the resting membrane potential changes into action potential. So that is threshold. What do you mean by stimulus? Stimulus means any change in the external environment. For example, if this is a nerve, it is at rest, insides are negative and outsides are positive. Now if you say you put an electrical stimulus or you touch it, so stimulus can be anything. It can be touch, that is mechanical, it can be electrical, it can be thermal, anything. Stimulus can be anything. So stimulus is basically a change in the external environment of the cell. So whenever the stimulus is of threshold strength, there is change in the resting membrane potential and generation of action potential. We'll talk about generation in detail under the second subheading. Right now I'm just telling you the description. I'm explaining you the introduction. The word threshold means minimal strength of stimulus that is needed or required to produce action potential. From this example, it's clear. Minimum force required to just move this object is called threshold force. So threshold stimulus is the minimum force required. Or above stimulus. It's very obvious. If you apply a force more than the threshold force, this object will start moving definitely. Similarly, it's the case with nerve fiber. If the strength of the stimulus is above threshold, you will definitely get an action potential. So this is all about the description of action potential, and it is very simple. It refers basically to the change in the resting membrane potential when the stimulus applied is of threshold or supra-threshold strength. Alright, so now we are done with the introduction of action potential. We have seen what action potential is. Now let's come to the ionic basis with action potential curve. This is the action potential curve of a large myelinated nerve fiber. Now remember, action potential takes place in many other tissues like SA nodal fibers or Purkinje fibers in the heart. But here we are considering, for understanding purposes, a large myelinated nerve fiber. Now to begin with the ionic basis, we'll consider this nerve fiber to be in a state of rest, that is at resting membrane potential. The insides are negative and the outsides are positive, and we know that the resting membrane potential of a large myelinated nerve fiber is about minus 90 millivolts, right? And this is also known as the state of polarization or the polarized state, as we have discussed in the lectures of resting membrane potential. Now here the minus 90 millivolt line represents the resting membrane potential. Okay, this is the resting membrane potential, and we are starting with the polarized state, that is here. This is the nerve fiber at rest at the resting membrane potential in the polarized state. Now what happens is that you apply a stimulus. Now remember, the stimulus should be of threshold or above strength. Only then will you get an action potential, otherwise you won't get an action potential. Okay, what will happen, I'll tell you later. If the threshold stimulus strength is not reached and the strength of stimulus is below threshold, I'll tell you what happens, but later. Action potential does not occur. Action potential occurs only if the strength is threshold or more. So now say we have applied a threshold stimulus at this site. Okay, at this site. Now we all know from our previous lectures that the cell membrane has various proteins which act as channels. If you see our transport across cell membrane lectures, there we have discussed in detail about the proteins. This protein acts as channels. Channels are for different ions. We say there are sodium channels and there are potassium channels. We've also talked about channels being gated, that there are gates in the channel. There are literal gates. If this is a channel, then there are gates in the channel which control the movement or opening and closing of the channel. Now sodium channels or potassium channels, whatever channels are, based on gating, they are of 2 to 3 types. Voltage gated, they can be ligand gated, or they can be mechanosensitive or pressure gated, right? We've done it in the previous lectures. So here we will talk about the sodium and potassium channels, and since we are dealing with the potentials, it is common sense that these will be voltage gated channels. Okay, these will be voltage gated channels. Now to add another bit of information here, these gates are of 2 types. See, channels based on gating are of 3 types. But these gates themselves are of 2 types, activation gate and inactivation gate. Okay, that was just for information. So let's come back here. Here we have applied a threshold stimulus. So what happens here is that these channels, the sodium channels here, they tend to open up and sodium starts moving inside. Only at this point for right now, okay? Very few sodium channels open at the point of application of stimulus, and sodium tends to move inwards. Now normally the insides are negative and outside is positive. If a positive ion moves inwards, the negativity inside reduces. That is, if say the inside negativity is minus 90 millivolts, due to entry of positive charge, this minus 90 millivolts begins to reduce in negativity and tends to move towards a positive state. This, as you can see, this little part here, this represents that it is moving towards a positive state because sodium is moving inside. There is influx of sodium. very slight, very minor at the point of application of threshold stimulus, right? So this sodium starts to move in. Now as sodium starts to move in, the negativity inside reduces and reaches a particular level. This level is known as threshold level or firing level. Now what happens at this level is that sodium ions diffuse inwards slowly, hence there is slow rise. As the threshold level is reached, large number of sodium channels open. Large number of sodium channels open and the membrane permeability of sodium increases by around 5000 times, and large amount of sodium moves in. If such a huge amount of sodium moves in, the negativity inside quickly turns into positivity. That is, the membrane threshold inside, the potential inside, it rises above zero, as you can see. And this phenomena is called as depolarization. The state was polarized, now it got depolarized. That is, the insides now become positive and the outside has now become comparatively negative because large amount of sodium has moved in. Now the question is, if sodium is moving in and the insides are getting positive, till how much amount or till what level will the positivity rise inside? As you can see here, the positivity rises till about plus 30 millivolts. Now why is that so? But before I go into the reason, let me tell you that this part of the graph above the zero is known as positive potential, is known as positive potential or overshoot potential, because it is overshooting the zero mark. This is known as overshoot potential or positive potential, right? So this is overshoot potential. Now what is the reason? Reason is this. What is the level? Why have I said it is about plus 30 millivolts? Now it is not fixed that it's plus 30, but the concept here is that we have considered in the last lecture of resting membrane potential the Nernst equation. According to Nernst equation, the equilibrium potential of sodium is about plus 61 millivolts, right? We have said in the Nernst theory that if an ion moves across a membrane which is permeable only to that ion, for example here it is sodium, so sodium will keep on moving till a point comes where sodium on both the sides is equal and there is no net movement, and the potential here is called as Nernst potential. So sodium will keep on moving till its Nernst potential is reached, that is plus 61 millivolts. So when sodium moves in, it tries to take the potential inside towards its Nernst potential, because sodium will keep on moving in until this potential is reached. So membrane potential inside will move upwards and try to reach plus 61 millivolts, but it does not happen so. Why? Because number one, these sodium channels that are opened, they remain open for very short duration. So once large amount of sodium enters in, these close, these channels close. That is, their activation gates open, sodium moves in. Their inactivation gates close and sodium influx stops. What happens? The inactivation gates of the sodium channels close. Remember, so inactivation gates close and sodium stops moving in. So membrane potential, instead of reaching plus 61, stops at around plus 30 to plus 45 millivolts. Therefore, it does not reach plus 61 millivolts. Another reason for it to not reach plus 61 millivolts is that as the sodium channels close here, this point, sodium channels close, the membrane potential starts falling back. This is because the potassium channels open. So if potassium channels open, say this is a potassium channel. If potassium channels open, the potassium moves outside. So the positivity inside reduces. This is another reason why the positivity does not reach plus 61 millivolts. The first reason is the sodium channels close, the inactivation gates close. The second reason is that potassium starts moving out. So the positivity inside that has been accumulated, it starts to move outside. So the positivity is lost. Therefore, it does not reach plus 61 millivolts and stops at around the plus 30 millivolt level. So this is known as depolarization. Now what happens that after depolarization, there is closure. At this point, sodium channels are completely closed. At this level, sodium channels are closed and potassium channels begin to open. Here the potassium channels have opened and large amount of potassium starts moving out. So if potassium starts moving out, then positivity inside reduces and the negativity inside is restored, right? Inside was positive in depolarization. Since potassium is moving out, positivity is lost, so negativity is restored. It is not completely restored, it begins to get restored, and therefore we call it as repolarization. That is, the polarized state, the normal negative state inside is getting achieved again. That is repolarization. Therefore this stage is called repolarization. Now if you notice here, this entire part, this entire slope till here is repolarization actually, or till here you can say till resting membrane potential is repolarization. If you notice closely, initially there is very rapid, since this is time in milliseconds. So if you notice here, this is depolarization and the center of this spike is where depolarization ends and repolarization begins. This part, in this very steep slope, repolarization is very quick. Later, towards the later part of the repolarization is slow. It gets slow. Why? Because when suddenly the potassium channels open, large amount of potassium moves out, leads to sudden fall in the positivity. But as the potassium moves out, the electrochemical gradient of potassium reduces, right? Because potassium gets accumulated outside, so it will oppose any more potassium coming. So the speed of potassium moving out, or the potassium efflux rate, reduces, and this causes slow repolarization. Now another important concept here, we have covered polarization, depolarization, repolarization. Now what happens is, what should have happened ideally is that the membrane potential should have reached the resting membrane potential, that the inside should have been negative completely and outside should have been positive, just like the initial resting membrane state. But that does not happen. What happens is that the membrane potential dips further below the resting membrane potential. That is, the insides tend to get over negative, more negative than the resting membrane potential. And this phenomena is called as hyperpolarization, right? You are polarized means you are negative inside. You are hyperpolarized means you are more negative than normal, more negative than rest. So this is known as hyperpolarization. Now why does this occur? This occurs because these potassium channels, they are slow to close. So potassium channels remain open for longer time, so potassium keeps moving out. Even when the resting membrane potential is reached, potassium channels are open. So potassium keeps moving out and the membrane becomes more negative, the potential becomes more negative. Okay, so this is known as hyperpolarization, and after hyperpolarization, the potassium channels completely close and the resting membrane potential is restored. Okay, it is restored back to the RMP level. So hyperpolarization is restored back to RMP level. So again, we started with polarized state, that is resting membrane potential. Then we talked about depolarization. We applied a stimulus. At that site, the permeability of sodium increased. The potential slowly, gradually rises to threshold level. As the threshold level is reached, large number of sodium channels open, and sodium tends to move inwards. That is sodium influx. Sodium moves inwards, inside positivity rises, moves upwards. This is known as overshoot potential above zero. After depolarization, the potassium channels open, the sodium channels close. So there is repolarization. Repolarization initial part is fast. In the later part, the repolarization is slow. The resting membrane potential is reached and the membrane potential is further lowered, known as hyperpolarization. This state of hyperpolarization is restored till the resting membrane potential, and that is how one action potential is completed in a nerve fiber. This is how one action potential is completed in a nerve fiber. Just one more point here, that this phase of quick depolarization and quick repolarization, this is a spike. This appears like a spike. So this is known as spike potential. This potential is known as spike potential. Okay, don't get confused with the overshoot potential and spike potential. Overshoot potential is the amount of positive potential reached. Spike potential is quick depolarization plus quick repolarization, because it represents a spike. So this is spike polarization. Okay, yes, spike potential, right? So that is all about the ionic basis of action potential along with its curve. Now that we've seen the ionic basis of action potential, let's come to the last two subheadings of action potential, the conduction and the properties. So first we'll consider conduction. Now conduction of action potential differs in unmyelinated nerve fiber and myelinated nerve fiber. As you know, based on myelination, based on the presence of myelin sheath, the nerve fibers are classified as unmyelinated without myelin sheath and myelinated obviously with myelin sheath. Right. So in unmyelinated nerve fiber, what happens is that this is the resting membrane potential state, or the state of polarization, or the polarized state. Insides are negative and outsides are positive. Now say at this point we apply a threshold stimulus or a supra-threshold stimulus. So what happens is that depolarization occurs and the insides become positive and outsides become negative. Depolarization occurs, right? So depolarization occurs, insides are positive, outsides are negative. Now what happens is that the positive and the negative charges come to lie next to each other inside the cell. So what happens is that current starts flowing from positive to negative side, right? Current starts flowing from positive to negative side. So positive charge moves here and this in turn becomes negative again. So this side has now become positive and this has become negative, right? So positive charges moves here and this positive moves here. This positive moves here. So this positive moves, this again will move further and the further charges move, and this is how an action potential is propagated in an unmyelinated nerve fiber. Understand? Clear? Very easy. Just the flow of currents. Difference in charges, flow of currents. Difference in charges and flow of currents. Just one cycle. Very simple. Coming to myelinated nerve fiber, what happens here is that there's presence of this myelin sheath. This is the myelin sheath. Now as we all know, myelin sheath is an insulator. It does not allow current to pass. So current cannot flow like this freely. Supposing if there is a myelin sheath here, it won't allow the accumulation of charges here. It is an insulator. So current or action potential cannot flow like this way in myelinated nerve fiber. So what happens is that myelin sheath has certain gaps in between. You see, if this is myelin sheath, there is a gap in between. And these gaps are known as nodes of Ranvier. These are known as nodes of Ranvier. So what happens is that this area, the node of Ranvier, is very rich in ion channels. It is rich in ion channels. So what happens is that at rest, the insides are negative, the outsides are positive. Obviously, we apply a threshold stimulus here. There is reversal of charges. Now, what's interesting is that charges jump from one node of Ranvier to the other. They do not involve the myelin sheath because myelin sheath is an insulator. It does not involve the myelin. It jumps from one node to the other, from the other node to the next one, and so on. And this type of conduction is known as saltatory conduction. What is it called? Saltatory. This is called saltatory conduction, which occurs in myelinated nerve fibers, right? The action potentials jump from one node of Ranvier to the other. Now what happens is the advantage or the positive point of this conduction is that it is faster. The speed is faster compared to unmyelinated nerve fibers. Okay, so this is all about the conduction of action potential in a nerve fiber. Moving on to the properties of action potential. So properties of action potential say that basically there are 3 to 4 properties. Here we are considering 4. Threshold stimulus, as already explained. What is threshold? All or none law. All or none law states that if a threshold or above stimulus is applied, the action potential will reach its maximum magnitude, or the tissue will respond maximally or not respond at all. This means that if a sub-threshold stimulus is applied, there is no action potential. But if a threshold stimulus is applied, an action potential is there, and say it reaches about plus 30 millivolts. Now if the strength of stimulus is increased above the threshold, it is supra-threshold, action potential will still be there, but it will still be just 30. So it means that even if you increase the strength of stimulus, the magnitude of action potential remains constant. It is the same at threshold, it is the same at supra-threshold. So this is what the all or none law states, that if the stimulus is threshold, it will respond maximally or all, and if it is not threshold, it will respond none. The response is none. So the response is either 0 or the response is maximum. This is what the all or none law states, and action potential follows all or none law. The third property is the refractory period. Now refractory period is a period, or it is a time interval between two action potentials in which the nerve fiber does not respond to another impulse. For example, if this is a nerve fiber and say there is one action potential that has been completed. Now for the second action potential to start, there is a time gap in between. Now this is known as the refractory period. Okay, so you say that if you have stimulated a nerve once, and if the nerve is in its refractory period and you stimulate it again, it will not respond. This is known as refractory period. Refractory periods are of two types: absolute refractory period and relative refractory period. Absolute means no matter the strength of stimulus, the nerve will not respond at all after one action potential. So after one action potential, the nerve needs to rest a little, and then it can give you another action potential on stimulus. So that rest period is refractory period. So refractory period's initial part is absolute refractive. No matter how strong the stimulus, the nerve will not respond, will not give an action potential. Relative refractory period is a period, it is a part of refractory period, the later part of refractory period, in which if you give supra-threshold stimulus, you will get a less than normal or subnormal response. The action potential will be very weak, like this. Okay, so this is known as the relative refractory period. Now why does absolute refractory period occur? Absolute refractory period occurs because, as you know, these were channels and these were the inactivation gates that close. These inactivation gates remain closed until the potential is reached up to resting membrane potential. So if you stimulate here before one action potential is complete, the nerve will not respond. It has to reach the resting membrane potential, the inactivation gates have to open, and then another stimulus has to come and action potential will occur. Okay, so this is the concept of refractory period. And the fourth and the final property is conduction that we have discussed here. That action potential is conducted, it is propagated throughout a nerve fiber. So now we have talked about action potential in great detail. To summarize, we have introduced action potential. What action potential is? It is the brief sequence of changes in membrane potential. We've talked about the ionic basis of action potential. We've talked about the action potential curve, state of polarization, depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization. We've talked in detail about the molecular basis of each one of them. Then we've come to conduction of action potential in unmyelinated and myelinated nerve fibers. And lastly, we've seen the properties of action potential. So this is the way that is preferred to be written in the exam if this question comes. If you write it under these four subheadings, describing whatever you can with the curve and with the diagrams, you will definitely get more marks. So I hope this lecture made sense, and I hope you understood and it was easier for you. You can go back to your books and read it. You will definitely understand it better. And we'll see you in the next one with another interesting topic.